Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I would like to talk to you about a subject that is very different from the last thing we talked about. I was thinking recently about architecture and its impact on the mind. So, as some of you might know, I was born and raised, and I still live here, in Arizona. I had rarely until recently traveled out of the country, let alone out of the state. I've been to California and other places around the southwestern United States, but nowhere truly different, nowhere that contrasted heavily with where I live. It wasn't really until last year, on my 25th birthday, that I experienced something strikingly different from what I was used to. And that's when I traveled to London and Oxford in England, and I got to see a city that had just a strong sense of importance of its history, of its people, of what it had been through. Anywhere you go in London, you are just impressed upon by the scale of history that place has seen. This was in Oxford, actually. I was walking around, and all of a sudden I looked to my left, just on a random stone wall, there's an inscription saying, so-and-so was burned for heresy. Famous people lived next door to each other who never even knew each other. I believe at one point Darwin and Karl Marx were living not so far from each other in the 1850s in London. And walking around the city, you look up and there's all these old stone buildings, hundreds of years old, some of them, with such great care to the architecture, such great care to the design. There's beautiful stonework crafted by hand that has been preserved over the decades. Just a sense of symmetry and proportions to the doorways and to the streets, and it's more of a human scale than what I'm used to here in Phoenix. I remember looking up, and once over an old bookshop, I saw a little stone carving of an angel looking down. And just being around these things, it was uplifting. That's the one word I would use to describe it, uplifting. Especially in the center of the city. I believe it was in the middle of the city. The British Museum in London, a collection of 5,000 years worth of world history, everything from the ancient Babylonian and Assyrian and Egyptian civilizations, big Babylonian lions that you can walk through that were like the city gates, ancient Greek architecture and Roman paintings and all sorts of just beautiful things. Being in the British Museum was like walking through a celebration of humanity itself. It was so overwhelmingly uplifting and made me feel proud to be a human being. It was one of the most incredible experiences I've ever had. I never knew that being around well-crafted art, finely crafted buildings, things like that, could have such a strong impact on my state of mind. Now, it wasn't until I got back from England that I started looking into the history of architecture for myself, and I stumbled upon an article called The Mental Disorders That Gave Us Modern Architecture. I'll link it in the description so you can read it for yourself, and I highly recommend that you do. It's a history of 20th century architecture, the birth of modern architecture, and how PTSD and autism spectrum disorder influenced the kind of modern architecture that is popular in the United States in metropolitan areas like Phoenix, Arizona today. One great figure that was mentioned in the article that they talked about a lot was Le Corbusier, who was a Swiss-French architect who was the father of modern architecture, and he's a very controversial figure because people are so split on whether or not they like modern architecture. Le Corbusier has been posthumously diagnosed by modern psychiatrists as being on the autism spectrum. Of course, we didn't know back then in the early 20th century, we didn't know enough about autism to tell. The important thing about that is that some people on the autism spectrum look at images differently than people who are neurotypical. If you look at a heat map of where their eyes go to on an image when they're looking at it, in the article that I was talking about, they had pictures of kittens, and a normal person's eyes go right to the eyes and the face and the nose of the kitten, while someone on the autism spectrum looked right at the tips of the ears and sort of down and to the left in these very concentrated areas and away from the center of the face. The authors of the article said that this is important because the facade of a house, and facade means face, the front doors of the house sort of mimic a human face, and something about that subconsciously appeals to us because it seems more human. Meanwhile, someone like Le Corbusier might not see that same thing, or that might not click with him. Another important figure was, I can't remember the name of him, but he was a German German professor who introduced modern architecture curriculum to Harvard University. And he was a veteran of World War I. He had a particularly horrible experience in World War I. I think he survived a plane crash or something like that. But the important thing here is that he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, this is before we knew anything about PTSD, but it nonetheless impacted his his sense of art, his sense of scale, and his sense of aesthetics. He designed his house, his own house, just like a bunker from World War I. So it was back away from the street, high up on a hill, and it had a teeny little slit for a window, just like those, those pill, I think it's called a pill bunker, where you could just, you'd have a very rectangular stone fortification that would protect you from enemy fire, and you'd sort of have a little slit that you could look through and stick the barrel of your gun out to fire on the enemies. And it's very interesting because all of this trauma has directly impacted the turn that modern architecture has taken, and it impacts the way that the buildings that are currently being built look. Particularly in Phoenix, where I live, in metropolitan Phoenix, like I said, there's not as much history. We tend to pave over our history. There's so much new development, and it's all monotonous. It's all beige and brown and rectangular and square. Just Google modern Phoenix development or Phoenix architecture or something, and you'll see what I mean. It's all the same. There's no sense of scale. There's no sense of history. It doesn't look like, it looks like some sort of cookie cutter thing, stucco. Nobody really took any time to consider what it would look like. It's all very corporate, slapped together, and cheap looking. I just thought this was fascinating because whether or not you know it, where you grow up, the buildings that surround you, the things that you look at and interact with every day have a very strong impact on your state of mind. And I think it's important that we make the right decisions when it comes to architecture, when it comes to aesthetics, because that is in some way going to impact the very population that lives there. So thanks everyone for letting me rant tonight. Let me know in the comments what you think. Please go check out that article. I strongly recommend it. I think you'll really enjoy it. Let me know what you think. If if you like the city that you live in, if you disagree with me about modern architecture, I'm open to disagreement. Thanks for hearing me out. Have a good evening.